What happens when two of country music's biggest icons sit down for what's supposed to be a friendly chat, and it turns into one of the most explosive moments in daytime television history? The tension between Faith Hill and Kelly Clarkson reached a breaking point that nobody saw coming. And before we get into exactly what was said that made Faith stand up and walk off that stage, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which side you're on after hearing this whole story, because trust me, you're going to have an opinion. So let me set the scene for you. Faith Hill was supposed to be promoting her new project, just another day of press rounds. You know how it goes. Kelly Clarkson's show has always been known for its warm, welcoming atmosphere, where celebrities come to laugh, share stories, and promote whatever they're working on. It's comfortable, it's safe, or at least that's what everyone thought. Faith walked onto that stage with her usual grace, wearing this stunning outfit that had everyone talking, waving to the audience, who gave her the kind of standing ovation you'd expect for someone of her caliber. Kelly greeted her with that big smile she's known for. They hugged, and everything seemed perfectly normal. The audience was excited, the energy was high, and absolutely nobody in that studio could have predicted what was about to unfold. They started off with the usual softball questions, the kind of thing you expect on these shows. Kelly asked about Faith's family, about her marriage to Tim McGraw, and Faith gave those polished answers that she's given 1,000 times before. There was laughter, there were stories about life on the road, and for the first 10 minutes or so, this looked like it was going to be just another pleasant interview that would fade into the background of daytime television. But then something shifted, and you could feel it even through the screen. Kelly leaned forward in her chair, and her tone changed just slightly, enough that, if you were paying attention, you'd notice something was different. Kelly brought up Faith's career trajectory, specifically focusing on some of the choices Faith had made over the years about which projects to take and which ones to pass on. Now, on the surface, this seems like a reasonable topic for an interview, right? But the way Kelly phrased it, there was an edge to it that Faith clearly picked up on immediately. Kelly said something along the lines of, "You've had such an interesting career, Faith, but I think a lot of people wonder why you stepped back when you were at your peak. Was that a choice, or was that something that happened to you?" And you could see Faith's expression change just slightly. That professional smile getting a little tighter around the edges. Faith handled it diplomatically at first, explaining that she made conscious choices about her career and her family, that every decision was hers to make, and she stood by all of them. She talked about how being a mother was important to her, how she and Tim had built this life together, and how she had never felt like she stepped back from anything, but rather stepped into the life she wanted. It was a good answer, the kind of answer that should have satisfied Kelly and allowed them to move on to the next topic. But Kelly didn't move on. Instead, Kelly pressed further, and this is where things started to get uncomfortable. Even for the audience, who you could hear getting quieter, that nervous energy starting to fill the room. Kelly brought up specific projects that Faith had turned down, naming names and talking about roles that had gone to other actresses, other singers, and she asked Faith point blank if she ever regretted those decisions. If she ever wondered what her career could have been if she had made different choices. The way she said it, there was this implication hanging in the air that Faith had somehow squandered her potential, that she had let opportunities slip through her fingers. And Faith was clearly not appreciating the direction this conversation was taking. Faith took a breath, and you could see her making a decision in that moment about how to respond. She said, "Kelly, I think you're coming from a place of curiosity, but I want to be really clear about something. I have never regretted a single decision I've made about my career or my family. And I find it interesting that we're sitting here talking about what I didn't do instead of what I have done." That was the first real crack in the facade, the first moment where the tension became undeniable. The audience shifted in their seats, and Kelly's smile wavered. But she didn't back down. Kelly responded by saying that she was just trying to have an honest conversation, that her show was about getting real with guests, and not just doing the typical press junket stuff that everyone else does. She said something like, "I think the audience appreciates authenticity, Faith, and I'm sure they're curious about these things too. I'm just asking what a lot of people are thinking." And that's when Faith sat back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said something that you could tell came from a place of genuine frustration. She said, "Kelly, there's a difference between authenticity and judgment. And right now, I'm not sure which one we're dealing with here." The temperature in that studio dropped about 20 degrees in that moment. Kelly tried to laugh it off, saying she wasn't judging anyone, that she had nothing but respect for Faith and everything she'd accomplished, but the damage was already done. Faith wasn't buying it, and you could see in her body language that she was done playing nice. She uncrossed her arms and leaned forward, and she said, "You know what's interesting to me, Kelly? Is that we've been sitting here for 15 minutes, and you haven't asked me a single thing about what I'm actually here to promote. Instead, you seem more interested in dissecting decisions I made 20 years ago. And I'm wondering why that is." Kelly tried to steer things back, saying they would definitely get to Faith's new project, but that she thought this was an important conversation to have, that women in the industry face these choices all the time, and it's worth exploring. But Faith cut her off, not rudely, but firmly, and said, "I think what's worth exploring is why women are constantly asked to justify their choices in a way that men never are. Tim has taken time off. He's turned down projects. He's prioritized family, and nobody ever sits him down and asks if he regrets it or wonders what could have been. So why am I getting the third degree here?" The audience actually started clapping at that, and you could see Kelly wasn't expecting that reaction. She tried to regroup, saying that she asks tough questions of everyone. That's just her interview style, but Faith wasn't having it anymore. Faith said, "There's asking tough questions, and then there's coming in with an agenda. And I'm getting the feeling that you had your mind made up about this conversation before I even walked out here." Kelly's face flushed, and she insisted that wasn't true, that she had no agenda. But Faith just shook her head. Faith looked directly at Kelly and said, "I've been doing this for a long time, Kelly. I've sat through hundreds of interviews, and I know the difference between someone who's genuinely curious and someone who's trying to make a point. And right now, it feels like you're trying to make a point at my expense." Kelly started to respond, started to defend herself, but Faith held up her hand and said, "Let me finish." The studio went completely silent, and you could have heard a pin drop as everyone waited to see what Faith was going to say next. Faith continued, "I came here today in good faith, no pun intended," she said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, "because I thought we were going to have a conversation, a real conversation, not an interrogation about choices I made decades ago that have nothing to do with why I'm here. And honestly, Kelly, I expected better from you." That hit hard. You could see it on Kelly's face. And she tried to interject, tried to say that Faith was misunderstanding her intentions, but Faith wasn't done. She said, "You're a woman in this industry too. You know how hard it is. You know the scrutiny we face. So for you to sit here and essentially question whether I made the right choices with my own life and career, that's disappointing." Kelly's defenses were up now, and she fired back saying that Faith was being overly sensitive, that she was just trying to have a meaningful conversation and Faith was making it into something it wasn't. She said, "I think you're reading into this in a way that I didn't intend, Faith, and maybe that's on me for not being clearer, but I genuinely don't understand why you're so upset right now." And that right there was the match that lit the fuse. Faith's eyes narrowed, and she said in this very calm, very controlled voice, "I'm upset because you're sitting here telling me that my reaction to your questions is wrong. You're upset because instead of hearing what I'm saying, you're dismissing it and making this about me being too sensitive. And that's exactly the kind of thing that women do to each other that we should be moving past." The audience was completely torn. You could feel it. Some people were nodding along with Faith. Others looked uncomfortable, and Kelly was clearly struggling with how to respond to this. She said, "I'm not dismissing you, Faith. I'm trying to understand where this is coming from, because from my perspective, we were having a conversation and suddenly you're accusing me of having some kind of agenda against you." Faith laughed, but there was no humor in it, and she said, "Kelly, you've spent the last 20 minutes implying that I made the wrong choices, that I somehow failed to live up to my potential. And now you're confused about why that might bother me." Kelly shook her head and said, "That's not what I was saying at all. You're putting words in my mouth." Faith shot back, "Then what were you saying, Kelly? Because from where I'm sitting, every question you've asked has been loaded with the assumption that I should have done something different, that my life should have looked different, and I'm curious what gives you the right to make that judgment." Kelly's voice got a little louder, a little more defensive, and she said, "I have every right to ask questions. That's literally my job. I interview people, and sometimes those interviews go to places that might be uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean I'm attacking you. Faith stood up at this point, not dramatically, but purposefully, and she said, ... asterisk ... I think we have very different definitions of what an interview is supposed to be, Kelly, because where I come from, there's a difference between asking hard questions and making someone feel like they need to defend their entire existence. Kelly stood up too, which surprised everyone because usually the host stays seated. But she stood up and said, Faith, I think you're overreacting. And honestly, I'm a little shocked that you're making such a big deal out of this. We're just talking. And Faith, she just looked at Kelly for a long moment and said, That's the problem right there. You think this is just talking? But what you don't realize is that every question you've asked has been dripping with judgment. And now you're telling me I'm overreacting for calling it out? The producers were clearly starting to panic at this point. You could see people moving around behind the cameras, probably trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial or just let this play out. And Kelly must have gotten some kind of signal because she tried to pivot, tried to say that maybe they should take a break and come back and start fresh. But Faith shook her head and said, No, I think we need to finish this conversation right now because I'm not going to sit here during a commercial break and pretend like everything is fine and then come back out here and fake. Smile my way through the rest of this. That's not who I am. Kelly looked genuinely taken aback, and she said, I'm not asking you to fake anything. I'm just suggesting that maybe we both need a minute to cool down and recalibrate. Faith crossed her arms again and said, I don't need to cool down, Kelly. I'm perfectly calm. What I need is for you to acknowledge that this interview went off the rails because of the questions you chose to ask and the way you chose to ask them. Kelly's jaw tightened, and you could see her struggling with whether to apologize or defend herself. And she chose to defend herself. She said, Faith, I prepared for this interview. I did my research. I came up with questions that I thought would be interesting and would give the audience insight into who you are beyond the surface level stuff. And if that made you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. But I'm not going to apologize for doing my job well. The word sorry rang hollow because it was immediately followed by a but, and Faith clearly heard that too. She said, You know what's interesting about that apology, Kelly, is that it's not really an apology at all. You're sorry that I'm uncomfortable, but you're not sorry for what you did. And that tells me everything I need to know about how you actually feel about this situation. Kelly threw her hands up in frustration and said, What do you want me to say, Faith? Do you want me to get on my knees and beg for forgiveness because I asked you some questions that you didn't like? Is that what this is about? And Faith's voice got very quiet, very controlled, and she said, I want you to listen to me, really listen, and hear what I'm telling you about how this felt from my side of the table. Kelly took a breath and said, Okay, fine, I'm listening. Faith said, When you ask me why I stepped back from my career, what you're really asking is, why wasn't I more ambitious? Why didn't I want it badly enough? When you ask me if I regret the choices I made, what you're really asking is, don't you wish you had been more like other people who made different choices? And when you bring up projects I turned down and roles I didn't take, what you're really doing is creating this alternate reality where I made mistakes and now I have to live with the consequences. And all of that is based on your assumption that the life I chose is somehow less than the life I could have had. Kelly started to interrupt, but Faith held up her hand again and said, I'm not finished. Faith continued, You talk about authenticity and real conversations, but what you don't seem to understand is that real conversations require respect. They require you to come to the table with an open mind and a genuine curiosity, not a predetermined narrative that you're trying to fit me into. And every single question you asked me today was designed to fit that narrative, whether you realize it or not. Kelly's face was red now, and she said, That is absolutely not true. You're assigning motivations to me that I don't have. You're creating this whole story in your head about what I think and what I believe, and none of it is accurate. Faith tilted her head and said, Then explain to me why you haven't asked me a single question about my new music. About what inspired it? About what I want people to take away from it? Explain to me why that wasn't more interesting to you than dissecting my past. Kelly fumbled for a second, and then said, We were getting there, Faith. We had a whole segment planned about your new project. But we do this thing on the show where we start with getting to know the person before we get into the promotion. And that's what I was trying to do. Faith said, Getting to know someone and judging someone are two completely different things. And if you can't see the difference, then then that's a problem. The audience was so uncomfortable at this point. People were looking at each other, shifting in their seats, and you could tell they didn't know whether to clap or stay silent, or what to do with the energy in that room. Kelly took a step toward Faith and said, "I feel like no matter what I say right now, you've already made up your mind about me and about this interview. So I don't even know what the point of continuing this conversation is." Faith said, "The point is that I'm trying to help you understand something that apparently you don't want to understand, which is that the way you approached this interview was hurtful and dismissive. And instead of acknowledging that, you're making me the villain for having feelings about it." Kelly's voice rose slightly, and she said, "I'm not making you the villain, Faith, but I'm also not going to sit here and let you paint me as some kind of monster who is out to get you, because that's not what this was," Faith said. "I never called you a monster, Kelly, but I am saying that you were careless with your questions and careless with how you made me feel. And when someone tells you that you hurt them, the appropriate response is not to tell them they're wrong for feeling hurt." Kelly ran her hand through her hair, clearly frustrated, and said, "Okay, you want me to say I'm sorry? Fine. I'm sorry that my questions made you feel bad. I'm sorry that this interview didn't go the way you wanted it to. I'm sorry that we're standing here having this argument instead of talking about your music. Is that better?" Faith just stared at her and said, "That's another nan-apology, Kelly. You're sorry about the outcome, but you're still not taking any responsibility for your part in creating that outcome." Kelly's voice got sharp, and she said, "What do you want from me? Faith, seriously, what is it going to take for you to feel like this is resolved? Because I feel like I'm going in circles here, and nothing I say is going to be good enough for you." Faith said, "What I want is for you to stop being defensive for just 5 seconds and actually consider that maybe, just maybe, you could have handled this differently. That's all. Just acknowledge that you played a role in how this went down." Kelly said, "Of course I played a role. I'm the host, but you played a role too. You came in here with your guard up. You took everything I said in the worst possible way, and you escalated this into something it didn't need to be." Faith's eyes went wide and she said, "I came in here with my guard up. Are you serious right now? I walked onto this stage with nothing but good intentions and excitement to be here. And within 10 minutes you had me feeling like I was on trial for my life choices. So don't you dare try to flip this around and make it seem like I was the problem." Kelly said, "I'm not saying you were the problem. I'm saying we both contributed to this situation, and if you can't admit that, then you're not being as honest as you're claiming to be." Faith took a step back, literally and figuratively, and said in this very measured tone, "Kelly, I think we're done here." Kelly blinked and said, "What do you mean we're done? We still have 10 minutes left in the interview." Faith said, "I mean I'm done. I'm not going to stand here and continue this back and forth where you refuse to see my perspective and I'm somehow the unreasonable one for expecting better. So I'm going to go, and you can fill the rest of the time however you want." Kelly's face showed pure shock, and she said, "Faith, come on, don't do this. Don't walk off. Let's just sit back down and finish the interview like professionals." Faith laughed again, that same humorless laugh, and said, "Professionals, that's rich, coming from someone who just spent the last half hour making me feel." About 2 inches tall, Kelly reached out like she was going to touch Faith's arm and said, "I swear to you, that was not my intention. Faith, please, just sit down. Let's talk about your music. Let's reset and do this right." Faith pulled her arm away, not aggressively, but definitely definitively, and said, "The time to do this right was when I first sat down, Kelly. You don't get to spend 30 minutes tearing someone down and then ask them to stick around so you can build them back up for the cameras. That's not how this works." Kelly's voice cracked slightly, and she said, "I wasn't tearing you down, Faith, and I really wish you could see that. I was trying to have a substantive conversation with you, the kind of conversation I have with all my guests," Faith said. "If this is how you talk to all your guests, then I feel sorry for them, because this didn't feel substantive, it felt invasive. It felt like you were more interested in proving some kind of point than actually listening to what I had to say." Kelly wiped at her eye, and you couldn't tell if it was emotion or just frustration. And she said, "You know what, Faith, maybe you're right. Maybe I did ask the wrong questions. Maybe I did approach this wrong. But I'm human. I make mistakes. And I'm standing here trying to make it right, and you won't even give me that chance." Faith's expression softened just a fraction, and she said, "Kelly, some things can't be fixed with a quick apology and a reset. Some things require actual reflection and change. "And I don't think you're there yet," Kelly said. "So that's it. You're just going to leave. You're going to walk off my show and make me look like the bad guy in front of all these people and everyone watching at home." Faith shook her head and said, "I'm not making you look like anything. You did that yourself with the questions you asked and the way you responded when I told you how they made me feel. I'm just choosing not to participate in it anymore." Kelly's voice got louder and she said, "This is going to be everywhere. Faith, you know that, right? People are going to talk about this. They're going to pick sides. They're going to make this into some huge thing." Faith said, "Let them talk. I'd rather deal with that than sit here for another second, pretending like everything is fine, when it's clearly not." Kelly made one last attempt, her voice almost pleading now, and she said, "Faith, please. I am asking you as one woman to another, as someone who respects you and your career and everything you've accomplished. Please don't walk off this stage. Let's figure this out together." Faith looked at her for a long moment, and for just a second it seemed like maybe she was considering it. Maybe she was going to sit back down, and they were going to push through this. But then Faith shook her head slowly and said, ... Kelly. If you really respected me and my career, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now, because you would have respected me enough to ask better questions from the start." And with that, Faith turned toward the wings of the stage. Kelly called after her, "Faith, wait, please." But Faith didn't stop walking. Kelly followed a few steps and said, "You're really going to do this? You're really going to walk off?" And Faith paused, turned back just slightly and said, "I'm not walking off. Kelly, I'm walking away. There's a difference. One suggests I'm being dramatic. The other suggests I'm setting a boundary. And I'm choosing to set a boundary right now." The audience didn't know whether to react or stay silent. It was this bizarre moment where half the people looked sympathetic toward Faith, and the other half looked shocked that this was actually happening on live television. Kelly stood there in the middle of the stage, looking completely lost, and she said to the audience, "I honestly don't know what just happened. I thought we were having a conversation, and suddenly everything just fell apart." One audience member actually called out, "You should have listened to her." And Kelly's head snapped toward that section, and she said, "Excuse me, I was listening, but thank you for your input." Faith was almost to the side of the stage when Kelly said one more thing, loud enough for everyone to hear. She said, "You know, Faith, walking away doesn't make you right. It just makes you gone." Faith stopped dead in her tracks. The entire studio held its breath. Faith turned around slowly, walked back toward center stage, and the look on her face was something nobody in that room would ever forget. She said, "And staying here arguing with you doesn't make you right either. It just makes me complicit in whatever narrative you're trying to create. So yeah, I'm choosing to be gone because sometimes the only way to win is not to play." Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out, and Faith took that silence as her cue to leave, for real this time. She walked off that stage with her head held high, and you could hear her heels clicking against the floor until she disappeared completely. Kelly stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. And then she looked at the cameras and said, "Well, that was unexpected. We're going to take a commercial break, and when we come back, I honestly have no idea what we're going to do, but we'll figure it out." The audience gave this awkward smattering of applause, and then they cut away. But here's the thing that makes this whole situation even more intense. After Faith left, Kelly had to finish the show somehow. And from what people who were in the audience have said, she came back from commercial and was clearly shaken. Her energy was completely different, and she tried to play it off like it was just one of those things that happens in live television. But you could tell she was rattled. She brought out her next guest early, shuffled some segments around, and basically did everything she could to move past what had just happened. But it was the elephant in the room for the rest of the taping. The thing that nobody can stop talking about is who was actually in the right here. Because depending on who you ask, you'll get completely different answers. Some people think Faith overreacted, that Kelly was just doing her job as an interviewer, and Faith took it too personally and made it into something bigger than it needed to be. Other people think Kelly crossed a line, that she came into that interview with an agenda, and when Faith pushed back on it, Kelly couldn't handle being challenged and made it worse by being defensive. And then there are people who think they were both wrong, that they both let their egos get in the way of what could have been a great conversation. What's interesting is how this whole thing reflects a bigger conversation about how women interview other women, and whether there's this expectation that it should automatically be softer or more supportive, or whether women should be held to the same standard as male interviewers who often ask tough, uncomfortable questions. Some people are saying that if this had been a male host asking Faith these questions, nobody would have batted an eye. But because it was Kelly, another woman, there was this sense of betrayal that made it hit differently. Others are saying that's exactly the point, that women should be supporting each other, not tearing each other down. And Kelly missed an opportunity to do that. The reality is that both Faith and Kelly are human beings who had a moment of conflict that spiraled into something neither of them probably wanted. And now it's out there for the world to dissect and analyze and form opinions about. Faith made a choice to stand up for herself and walk away from a situation that wasn't serving her. And Kelly made a choice to ask the questions she thought were important, even when they made her guest uncomfortable. And whether you think either of those choices was right or wrong probably says more about your own values and perspectives than it does about what actually happened in that studio. What we do know is that this interview, or the lack thereof, is going to be talked about for a long time. It's going to be used as an example in conversations about interviewing, about boundaries, about respect, about how women treat each other in professional settings, and about what happens when two strong personalities clash in a very public way. Neither Faith nor Kelly came out of this looking perfect, but maybe that's actually the most honest part of the whole thing. The fact that it was messy and uncomfortable and real in a way that most television isn't anymore. So now I want to hear from you. Make sure you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And drop a comment below telling me, do you think Faith was justified in walking off that stage? Or did she overreact to questions that Kelly had every right to ask?